Good afternoon and welcome to the USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging's Fall Monday Seminar Series. Before introducing today's speaker, let me remind you that your questions can be added to the Q&A feature at any time during the presentation. There's no need to wait until the end. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Josiemer Mattei. Dr. Mattei is the Donald and Sue Pritzker Associate Professor of Nutrition in the Department of Nutrition at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Her presentation today is titled 20 Years of Nutrition Research for Puerto Rican Cardiometabolic Health from the U.S. mainland to the island. Dr. Mattei's research focuses on the genetic, dietary, and psychosocial risk factors for obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease in underserved and minority populations. And she uses this as a framework to explain health disparities. Her emphasis is on Latinos in the U.S. and Latin America, including cohorts in Puerto Rico and in the United States. She also has implemented culturally tailored dietary interventions to prevent type 2 diabetes and heart disease in both Boston and Puerto Rico. Dr. Mattei has received several prestigious awards in recognition of the importance of her research. These include the 2016 Mark Bieber Award for Outstanding Nutrition-Related Research from the American Heart Association, the 2019 Paul Sorley Early Career Investigator Award from the Hispanic Community Health Study, and the 2021 Alice Hamilton Award for Impact in Public Health and Future Promise. And finally, it's my pleasure to welcome back a distinguished graduate of the Tufts Friedman School and the HNRCA. And with that, let me turn the microphone over to Dr. Mattei.
Thank you so much, Paul. Everything okay technically? You can hear me okay? Sounds excellent. Thank you again for that introduction. I am beyond pleased to be back in my alma mater, and how I wish that I was there in person. But fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, from my perspective, fortunately, I am in Puerto Rico right now, precisely working on one of our projects. And but again, I would love to be there in person. I am a triple jumbo. I did my PhD as well as my MPH and master's at Tufts in nutrition, and my MPH in Tufts as well. And I am thrilled to be back to share with you what has happened since then, and how did we get from that picture on the left in Boston, in Villa Victoria, to that picture on the right in Puerto Rico. That's San Germán. That is my hometown in Puerto Rico, with 20 years of nutrition research, working towards cardiometabolic health for the Puerto Rican community. So thank you again. So if we're starting 20 years, well, if I'm titling this as 20 years, we should start 20 years back. So I had to dig out, where was I 20 years ago? And this is where I was. You might recognize this place. This is in the HNRC. And 20 years ago, I was a graduate student working under Jose Ordova's laboratory. And this is us. Please don't judge the food on the table right now. We were celebrating with cake, but no judgment about the food. That's us. You might recognize some people there that are still at the HNRC, great colleagues, great mentoring, excellent program for me to be in and thrive. And while I was there, I was very interested in learning more about nutrition, but also on the genetics components and how these two were interacting to derive the conditions that I was already seeing in my country, in Puerto Rico. But at that time, I was also starting to see, and there was research that was coming from Tufts and from the HNRC on how this was also transpiring in Boston and in the community, the Latino community in Boston, especially in the Puerto Rican community in Boston. How this population was already showing poor diet and health, especially higher rates of depression, particularly in the Puerto Rican community compared to other Latinos, higher hypertension and systolic blood pressure, more than 3 times higher than non-Hispanic whites, type 2 diabetes, and these 3 conditions tend to be consistently higher in Puerto Ricans, not only in Boston, but nationally, and poor dietary quality, particularly low intake of fruit, whole grains, vegetables, refined sugars, and refined carbohydrates, low low nutritional status, but as also social determinants, including poverty, disability, and food insecurity were particularly high in this population. So within that setting, I was very fortunately that again, 20 years ago, I got an email, March 20, 2002, from my mentor, Jose Ordovas, that they were writing a grant. We were working on a grant for Latinos to figure out more about this nutrition and these disparities, and including genetics and how we can start to understand that. And he was encouraging us to speak now. Like, here's the draft and speak now. And yes, I still keep my emails from Tufts, in case you're wondering. And this is why, because now they're very relevant. And I really appreciated this because it gave me an opportunity to start becoming involved on this large center study that was really integrating all of the potential factors for the disparities that we were seeing in the Puerto Rican population. And that led to this center grant that we proposed in 2003, where we wanted to, within the Puerto Rican older adult population, specifically living in Boston, in Massachusetts, the greater Boston area, understanding how these greater levels of stress, poverty, migration, the discrimination was contributing to allostatic load. And I'm going to talk about this in a second, and how allostatic load might be then contributing to the chronic diseases that I pointed out in the beginning. And within that, how genes were playing a role. Now, quickly, allostatic load, and I'm going to show several slides that are touching upon allostatic load, so let's get through it, refers to physiological wear and tear. And we use it a lot in health disparities models because it is posited that this load is brought upon repeated stressors or overloaded responses to that stress. So if you have a normal physiological stress response, you have a stress, your heart rate might go up, and then the stressors goes out and you're fine again. But when you're constantly having stressors, or when you cannot regulate those well and you become dysregulated, you have this overall body physiological load, and that's what we call allostatic load. And it is holistic. It encompasses various body systems. It starts initially as a perception from the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA axis, and it goes downstream. So we call those the primary markers that then activate secondary markers, usually in the cardiometabolic pathways, like obesity, glucose metabolism pathways, lipid markers. So it encompasses several body systems. And there has been data showing that that is sort of the pathway that contributes then to an accumulated chronic, accumulated burden of physiological burden that contributes to disease. So what happened? 2003, we get the grant. This was a project that was led by Dr. Catherine Tucker with Jose Ordovas and other investigators at Tufts as well. Our new grant was funded. Let's go celebrate. Cuban food, Latin music, October 10, 2003. So now you understand why I call this 20 years of Puerto Rican research. We've been doing this for 20 years. And now I want to go through where have we been with the Boston Puerto Rican Health Study and how we took that data and have been growing it to where we are right now in the island. I'm gonna call it the island. It's an archipelago. We have 2 more islands, but I'm gonna call it the island for simplicity. So we got established in 2004. We started recruiting 1,500 Puerto Rican adults aged 45 to 75. The study has been going on since then, with follow-ups at 2 years, 5 years, 10 years approximately. And of course, we have had some attrition, but it has been a really good resource to understand how things have changed and how these risk factors have changed over time. And as I mentioned, we really encompass all of these interaction of factors, including the dietary, the genetics, but also the psychosocial factors. Something that we were seeing a lot, as I mentioned, were depression and social determinants. So we included that as part of the grant as well. And the project also included a community arm that has been working on interventions of the community to address what we learn from the epidemiological studies. So a quick baseline of who the participants are. In the Boston Puerto Rican, well, they indeed show multiple disparities. Household income tended to be low, and again, this was 20 years ago, so it's a little bit on the lower side, but still, acculturation level of 24, this is pretty low on a scale of 0 to 100, indicating that they are still pretty attached to the Puerto Rican culture rather than the US culture, despite living here, living in the mainland US for an average of 34 years. So they still were pretty much culturally attached to the Puerto Rican identity. Physical activity score of 31 is aligned with a sedentary pattern. So they were pretty much a sedentary group. 25% of smoking, 39% of drinking. I think where the striking numbers are really in the conditions. 70% of abdominal obesity, 70% of hypertension, 40% of diabetes. So these are really high numbers. And by the way, these are lab-based, so these are clinically based. So what I'm going to show you now is a little bit of an overview of what we have learned in terms of the nutrition research for this group. One of the things that we started looking at was then what kind of nutrition or dietary patterns were associated with allostatic load. And one of the first ones that we looked at was an American Heart Association dietary recommendations pattern. And we noticed that this was linked to a lower metabolic syndrome and lower allostatic load. Interestingly, this was differential by men versus women, where in men, we saw that it was associated with metabolic syndrome, but not in women. And in women, it was associated with lower allostatic load, but not in men. And the differences were mainly because of the specific markers that each of these have. Metabolic syndrome is just metabolic, but allostatic load, as I mentioned, is more holistic, including other primary markers of the HPA axis, such as cortisol, such as epinephrine or epinephrine. So we believe, and indeed we saw in this paper, that some of those become more dysregulated in women than in men. And also the dietary recommendations tend to differ in terms of adherence by gender. So this is why we saw these differences by gender. Now, having said that, AHA guidelines tend to change with time. In fact, the ones that we used 20 years ago are different, not completely, but slightly different from the ones that we have now. So we took another approach and looked at population-based patterns. So these were data-driven patterns that we created when we derived from factor analysis from this study to look at how they associated with allostatic load. And we derived 3 patterns. One on meats, that one came out on meats and potatoes. And that one was indeed associated with higher allostatic load, as well with low DHAS, which is one of the primary markers, and likelihood of having high dysregulated hemoglobin A1C. The other 2 patterns that we identified were a traditional rice, beans, and oil pattern and a sweets pattern, and none of those were associated with allostatic load, interestingly. we believe that the rice, bean, and oils pattern is a little bit too mixed. There are healthy and not so healthy components in there that might kind of model that. And interestingly, nothing came up for the sweets, beverage, and dairy desserts, which also might have some beneficial components with the dairy and some less beneficial. Having said that, pretty clear and consistent with the meats and potatoes. So the other approach that we decided to take was using a more popular known pattern, because the situation with using the population base is that we cannot really compare it against other studies. It's just relevant to this group. Great for some things, not so great for others. So we used then a Mediterranean pattern that has been very well associated with chronic disease and multiple outcomes in multiple studies, and is promoted for the dietary guidelines right now. So while it is not traditional, we are not Mediterranean, so it is not relevant to us per se, but the way that it is defined with larger food groups allows for compatibility and allows to capture food. So one of the first things we did was indeed identify what are those Mediterranean-like foods that are consumed by Puerto Ricans. And they indeed are not typical Mediterranean diet. We rank those foods within each of these food groups, within, what are the vegetables, what are the cereals, what are the legumes that Puerto Ricans are consuming. And they are not the typical Mediterranean. So for example, instead of olive oils, in the oils, we had more canola or corn oil. Instead of salmon, we have more canned tuna or cod. But it really helped us identify what are those Mediterranean foods that Puerto Ricans are consuming. And with that, we created a Mediterranean score, and we tested association with cardiometabolic profile as well as with cognition. And we saw that following a higher Mediterranean-like pattern was linked to better cardiometabolic profile and better cognition. And we did this longitudinally within the 2-year follow-up. And this was for the cognitive outcomes. This was particularly more salient in participants with type 2 diabetes. Something that I should note is that one thing that I keep talking about with the dietary patterns and what is arising in the derived patterns is that they are really adhere to according to the cultural identity. And I mention this because I keep seeing literature that says that is say that Puerto Ricans or that Hispanic or pretty much any group that is migrating tends to have less healthy or a poorer diet quality as they acculturate more to the US. And what we observed in the Puerto Rican population was actually the opposite. But this really depends on how you measure diet and how you measure acculturation. So we have to be very careful about these statements and these overall statements because it really depends on what you're using. And to illustrate that, we use various examples of diet score. So we use an alternate healthy eating index, which is a score that is predefined based on foods that already have association with chronic disease. The Mediterranean diet score with Puerto Rican foods that I already showed, and the 3 patterns that were population derived that I already showed. And for measuring acculturation, we used 3 different scales. One that was language-based, so the more English that people spoke, it was considered as more acculturation. That's technically because we in Puerto Rico, we have both languages as official, so we speak English as well. Psychosocial base, which is more on our cultural identity or how I feel as more attached to the US culture or more attached to the Puerto Rican culture. So higher is more attached to the US. And then years of living in the mainland US, which is the proxy that you see in most of the acculturation studies that don't have a scale. And what was interesting is that here, people who identified more with the US culture were adhering more to the healthy dietary patterns. So the more acculturation, the better the diet. But this was only if we measure it with these scores, not with the traditional pattern per se. Having said that, we didn't find any association of the traditional pattern with disease. So this is not a helpful or unhelpful pattern per se. For me, for the Western pattern, which was loaded with, as I mentioned before, meats and potatoes, it was not associated with any acculturation pattern per se. And this kind of led us to believe that maybe this pattern is already brought from the island. And it started making us think about that. Something that I also want to mention is the psychosocial factors, and it's something that we have not forgotten about, and we have done a lot of work on this as well. So in this cohort, we have looked at how all of these various factors have influenced allostatic load. And we have reported that higher perceived discrimination, darker toned skin, higher depressive symptomatology, and higher food insecurity, all of these 4 factors are associated with higher allostatic load. Now, what is important is that I have shown a lot of risk factors for allostatic load, but further, as I mentioned, this is the pathway that eventually may contribute to disease. And we ended up showing that is that allostatic load in this cohort increases the odds of type 2 diabetes, CVD, cardiovascular disease, and both physical and cognitive impairment within the 5-year period, the first 5-year period of the cohort. And we show this using 3 different definitions of allostatic load that all including multiple physiological parameters. The more parameters that we included, the stronger the associations. But even with a reduced parameter, a reduced selection of body markers, we could still see associations for type 2 diabetes and physical impairment. So this is pretty important. We really want to avoid these risk factors for allostatic loads because we do see that they do increase type 2 diabetes and physical impairment. Last thing that I want to show about the Boston Puerto Rican is that not only when we looked at diet, we have also looked at some of the other behavioral factors, and we created an overall lifestyle score. And we noticed that the odds were for allostatic load and metabolic syndrome were lower for this overall score, but not specifically for the individual ones when we included them all in the same model. So we believe that there might be some other synergistic effects from all of these that need to happen. And when we were doing our previous studies, we adjusted but might not include, for example, social support that was coming up as pretty strongly as lowering the odds of allostatic load. And that has really starting to make us think and refocus on the importance of social support and protective psychosocial factors for allostatic load, for inflammation, disease, and so forth. So as we started thinking of all of this, there was still something missing. And the missing part was like, it was Puerto Ricans in Boston, but we keep seeing these trends of cardiometabolic conditions happening in the island. And I showed, for example, this Western pattern that didn't show any association with acculturation. They were really starting to raise questions about what was going on in the island, in Puerto Rico. And that's because place matters. The characteristics of Puerto Ricans living in the island and Puerto Ricans living in the mainland are pretty different, are quite starking, even though if you see us, we're pretty much the same people. But the population has shifted. There has been a large migration, especially in the past 20, 30 years. And with fewer Puerto Ricans living in the island than in the mainland Puerto Rican. Having said that, as I showed before, most of them still clearly identify as Puerto Rican, have a really strong sense of cultural attachment, making them Puerto Ricans just living elsewhere. But they are a very coherent ethnic group. This number, by the way, was completely shifted 25 years ago, with 5 million in the island and maybe 4 million in the mainland. The older population is really growing in the island. We have an aging population and aging fast. Language use is primarily Spanish in the island, but as I mentioned, English and Spanish are both official. Education is pretty high, especially in the island, with most of the population having bachelor's degrees or higher. Having said that, the socioeconomic disparities in the island are wider and more striking. You can see the median income, you can see the poverty rates, how striking those are, the level of receiving SNAP, or in Puerto Rico, the equivalent, which is the NAP. That is not the same as SNAP. It is a different mechanism. And even home ownership is higher here, despite this socioeconomic disparities. So it's a striking picture. So since a long time, we have been trying to figure out how do we get this. How far back? Well, this is an email from, oh, this is very small, 2006. Again, my mentors, Dr. Ordovas and Katie Tucker, were very, very enthusiastic and very open to me exploring these avenues, and we were really trying to engage investigators here in the island, including Dr. Paloni, who was doing a study of elderly adults at that time. And we emailed him to see if we could examine how genetic and behavioral factors intertwine to affect allostatic load in elderly Puerto Rico and explore the migration of social stressors. This was back in 2006. At that point, it wasn't possible. The collaboration couldn't happen for no particular reason. We have collaborated with Dr. Paloni a lot afterwards, but it was just the right time. So it wasn't until 2015 when I was already a faculty person at Harvard that we finally got a first leg into studying some of these in Puerto Rico. And this was through Pratt Lab. This was a very small pilot study, but this is what got us a leg into studying this in Puerto Rico. This was the Puerto Rico Assessment of Diet, Lifestyle, and Disease. Small observational study of 380 adults. We kind of mirror as much as possible as after the Boston Puerto Rican study. It was only in the San Juan metro area, but you can see some of the pictures and the numbers that I was showing before. High educational attainment, and it had nothing to do with the recruitment strategy because we were recruiting actually in a very diverse socio-demographic and socioeconomic community clinic area. Household income was very low, despite that high educational attainment. And food insecurity, food assistance was really high, 50% of them on NAP, and food insecurity at 15%. What really helped us with this study was starting to get a picture of the conditions. This is self-reported. We were not able to get lab-based at this study, but we got self-reported and looking at hypertension, anxiety, obesity, arthritis, high cholesterol, depression, and respiratory problems as the main issues coming up in this population. And more importantly, diet, which at that point we had very little of knowledge in Puerto Rico. And we used a validated food frequency questionnaire, validated specifically for the population of Puerto Rico in the island. And this is the percent of people meeting the recommended intake for each of or adhering to the guidelines for each of these groups. You can see it's extremely low. Look at red and processed meat. And as I mentioned, this is one of the more tricky food groups that we were showing with allostatic load and with disease in previous analysis. Fruits, sodium, sugary beverages, polysaturated fats. So seems to be like the fats, the meat, and the fresh produce is what's really challenging for this community. Now, the study did give us a lot of opportunities to look at some potential contributors to that poor diet quality. And this was an analysis done actually by a student at Tufts, Naila Besares. She's now a doctoral student, who looked at the association, the consumption of foods away from home and the frequency of that consumption in association with diet quality, which in this time we measured using the alternate healthy eating index, or that predefined score that I mentioned before. These are all statistically significant differences in the sense that higher frequency of consumption was associated with lower diet quality for consumption at any kind of establishment away from the home. Fast foods, chain restaurants, other type of restaurants, takeouts, cafeterias, food trucks. Not only that, but what was very interesting that it was also found for consumption away from home at non-commercial places, this C over here, non-commercial places. And that we had a question in our questionnaire that asked about consuming foods at your relatives' home, at your friends' houses, outside of your own prepared meal, but not a commercial side. And that was very interesting to us. And in fact, there is some research, and it's a research that we're expanding upon, on how we use food as a way to pamper or to show love, but maybe not in the healthiest way. And people ended up eating more calories, more salt, more sugar in those settings. So this was a very interesting concept that we had not been shown before in the literature, and that we're exploring before. We're exploring more now to see how we can then apply some messages for cooking outside of the home and cooking for others in a more healthier way. We also look at questions on purchasing locally sourced foods. And we saw that people who purchase locally sourced products, and we know this because in Puerto Rico, there is a law that supports and that includes labeling of products produced here, yes. So any fruit and vegetable produced locally, meats that are from here, have a special label that says del país, or hecho en Puerto Rico, made in Puerto Rico, or from the country, like from here. And people know that. Not only that, but there's also the farmers market that people come and buy specifically from here. So people can go and buy those specifically, and those tended to be, people who did that tend to have higher scoring of intake of vegetables, whole grains, nuts and legumes, and overall diet quality, which I'm not showing here, but overall diet quality. Now this is purchasing, so we still have the question on intake, and that's something that we want to follow up. So Bradman was super useful for us, and it gave us a lot of information. Now, the only challenge was that it was small, it was only in San Juan, it was cross-sectional, we didn't have any lab-based information, but we were starting to get some pictures of what was going on. What we really wanted was a large trial and something that could really connect us to what we're seeing in Boston. And we wanted that cohort, so we started proposing it. But then, and this happened, and this was in 2017, we had the big Hurricane Maria, and it completely destroyed the island, completely. There was no part of the island that Maria did not touch. So this completely changed what some even of our hypotheses of food, of food access, of disease. And we had to revise our perspective of how moving forward the island was going to recover, the island was going to work on food systems, on health services, and so forth. We were writing the grant for a cohort in the middle of Maria. We revised it immediately, and we were extremely fortunate to work with partners that helped us get that grant in 2018. And that is Fundación de FDI Clinical Research. That's where I am right now, right here on this corner. Beautiful building. You're all invited to come visit us. And working also with UMass Lowell, with Dr. Katie Tucker, who's still my partner. We created PROSPECT, the Puerto Rico Observational Study of Psychosocial, Environmental, and Chronic Disease Trends. And this is truly a parallel study and model after the Boston Puerto Rican study, but in Puerto Rico. It is also modeled after the Hispanic Community Health Study on Latinos, or the SOUL study. So we also have investigators from SOUL in our cohort. And we did this with the whole goal of comparing and contrasting what we are seeing in the island with what we are seeing with Puerto Ricans in the mainland. So right now we are recruiting 2,000 adults, ages 30 to 75, using a multi-sampling strategy. It is a longitudinal. We follow people every 2 years. And we also have various arms, a food-related arm, a psychosocial arm. And we are also have a really strong anchor on public health priorities and moving forward the public health agenda of the island. So where are we? Well, we've had some challenges enumerating, as you can imagine, post-Maria. Wherever we thought that we were going to find a house using our enumeration maps, there was none. Where that X is that we were supposed to find a house and it was destroyed. So we had challenges and we had to move into community recruitment. COVID also has derailed us a lot. And finding a house in rural areas was also a challenge. That over here, this is the house that we had to get access to. So as you can imagine, it's been challenging. But despite of that, we've had an amazing success. We've had recruited 1,500 to date. We're still recruiting. We have a big last push of 500 participants in the next month that we would have finished if it wasn't for COVID. We have 83% retention rate and 95% of data completion. And to me, the biggest point of pride is that we have almost 100% satisfaction rate in the study. And I still want to find that one person who is not satisfied with the study and would like to have a conversation with him or her. How do we do this? Well, we have more than 55 partner clinics for examination that participants can go to those clinics or places. We also have partnerships and collaborations with professional organizations and community organizations, civic organizations. Whenever that cannot happen, we then go to the home of the participant and we do make the visit at the home, everything using standardized protocols. We collect data very comprehensively on social and health factors, everything that you can possibly imagine, detailed migration data, medical history, medical services, all of the environmental and behaviors, including a very detailed food frequency questionnaire, data on food insecurity using the USDA module, a thorough food behavior questionnaire, which I think is as important as the actual intake, food-related environments, hurricane exposures, and we have been adapting this. Puerto Rico is very prone to disasters. So when we had COVID, we have included a questionnaire on COVID exposures. When we had the earthquakes, we included questionnaires on earthquake exposures. So every time we have something in the island, we adapt and we include that. And a very, very robust battery of psychosocial factors, both the more negative, depression, anxiety, trauma, but also the positive, including coping, resiliency, and social support that, as I mentioned, is becoming as something more important in this population. We collect and we store traditional CAD markers and stress markers. Again, we focus this and make this as parallel as possible. The Boston Puerto Rican study and allostatic load is one of our outcomes. We have all of the markers, including neuroendocrine, stress hormones. We collect blood, urine, saliva, and hair. And we have about 90% of the biosamples collected. Participants are very engaged. And we biostore everything with 95% of all of our data of samples biostored. Something that, as I mentioned, is very important is that we are anchored on 4 strategic initiatives, not only the research, but also the capacity building and in education and training. We have trained more than 50 mentees and trainees in not only in Puerto Rico, but nationally and internationally. We have students from Brazil, from Mexico, from China coming to train and learn from the field to data. We have the research infrastructure and ancillary studies that I'll show you more about later, but we also have a very strong anchor on community outreach and public health policy. So we've been working with various agencies to everything that we learn or everything that we're doing, making sure that we have an impact at the same time rather than waiting until our study is done. Very quickly, let me show you some of the things that we have been learning from Prospect. First of all, it is definitely demonstrating some of the needs that are in the population, and some of them are similar to what we were seeing in Boston. Some of them are quite more striking. Education, really high, 73% of college or higher educational attainment. Again, this is not a product of our recruitment strategies. This is also coming along in the BRFSS and in the Institute of Statistics population-wide numbers. Income, low income, 57%. Again, despite the high education, there's low income in the population. There's a lot of food insecurity, with almost 1/3 of the population having marginal low or very low food insecurity, and half of the population receiving NAP. And again, this is where it gets very striking, the health conditions and the outcomes. 90% with elevated waist circumference, 60% high blood pressure, half of them with low HDL. These 3 also come up very commonly in all of the studies that we're doing. And 27% with depressive symptoms, depression also being one of the conditions that we saw in the Boston, Puerto Rico community. One of the first studies that we did was look at the conditions that were reported before and after Maria. And we were able to do this because we had the PRODLAT study. We had the study that was conducted in 2015, and then we had Prospect. We restricted the data to up to COVID, so anybody who was recruited before the COVID pandemic, to make sure that this was not influenced by COVID outcomes. And what we saw was that they were all higher after Maria. And we are starting now some analysis to see if this was mediated by more bad behaviors or by health services of what really was driving these differences. But everything moved up after that. Maria was, as I mentioned, was massively disruptive. There were many personal, material, and service losses. The personal being like fears and deaths and loss of family members, and the material being really, losing your home and losing cars or part of your home. And the service losses were also quite prevalent, with people losing power for months, losing water service for weeks, running out of stored food for weeks. So this was pervasive. I was in the island 1 week before the hurricane hit. By the way, nobody knew this was going to happen. And I came back 3 months later, and it was night and day. So this really lasted a long time. what we noticed is that all of these experiences were associated with higher depressive symptomatology, PTSD, and anxiety. But interestingly, more so for the personal impact. So these losses, this fear of losing your family, this not being able to find your people, than for losing your property or even losing services. So again, this goes back to all of this concept of the social connection and the social support, and people might not really care that much of whether they lost the food, but this is really what is driving this depression and this anxiety. Having said that, we also conduct a lot of qualitative work in our group, and we talk to people across the food system, from farmers to consumers to food producers. And you heard a lot of resiliency across this. You know, there was a coming together, this spirituality. I would say that was the most important thing, the strength of being able to help each other. So we have been focusing a lot on this resilience and coping strategies as a potential mechanism to buffer potential behaviors, unhealthy behaviors. And in this analysis from a postdoc at Harvard, Laura Sampson, analyzed how found that higher resilience and coping were associated with better sleep, physical activity, and diet intake, not with drinking or smoking. Interestingly, we believe that these are more stable, like people who tend to be more resilient are more stable in their behaviors with this, while these are more changing depending on the stressors. But this gives us a potential strategy for strengthening resilience and coping for maintenance of health behavior. Lastly, I want to show two other studies that we did around in this group. Was one on food insecurity, which, as I mentioned, was quite high in this group. And we found that it was associated with emotional and uncontrolled eating behaviors, both higher. And for us, this is important because we believe that this might be a pathway on how food insecurity is associated with obesity and with other outcomes in other metabolic outcomes. We usually tend to look at that pathway through diet quality, but this is actually, even after we adjusted for diet quality, this association persisted. And even adjusting for current stress, it got a little bit attenuated, but it still persisted. So we believe that food insecurity might be a pathway there, and we're waiting for longitudinal data to come out next year to look at this a little bit further. And lastly, I mentioned that we were going to come back to the data-driven patterns. We decided to do a data-driven pattern analysis in our cohort in Puerto Rico and see what came up. And as you remember, in Boston, we had a Western pattern. We had that was more meats and potatoes. We had the traditional pattern, and we had the sweets pattern. Well, very interesting things came across here in Puerto Rico, sort of similar, but also a little bit different. We had a conventional pattern that was also beans and rice and beans and coffee, and that was more like a rural pattern. We had an industrial meat-centric pattern. We had a sugar-centric pattern. But what came up new was this neo-traditional pattern that was a very healthy one, marked by fresh produce, specifically tropical produce, and fish intake. And that variable that we had on purchasing local products, we integrated that to know our foods, where our foods were coming from, and the neo-traditional patterns was being loaded by those local foods. So interestingly, that neo-traditional pattern that is more healthy produce and fish was associated with lower metabolic syndrome. And now we are really thinking that that might be a potential path for us to leverage those foods for prevention of metabolic conditions. As I mentioned, we have several funded studies, auxiliary studies, and one that I really want to highlight is, I mentioned we have everything going on except our genetics part. But that question that we started raising a little while ago, we came back to it. And now we have an ancillary study that is with Dr. Jose Ortobas, because our partnership has never ended. And we have a study on social epigenetics where we are hypothesizing that these more adverse factors in the mainline might increase DNA methylation and type 2 diabetes. And we're looking at DNA methylation in both the Boston, Puerto Rican study and Prospect and contrasting that to see that. And what we're seeing with this resilience happening in Puerto Rico might be part of this explanation. This just started and we're very excited that this project is going to be happening and kind of closing the loop in what and in everything that we've been raising the questions on. So with that, let me share a couple of lessons learned and key messages that I want to highlight. First of all is that the health and nutrition challenges exist both in the US mainland and in the island for Puerto Rican, but they're slightly different. I mean, they exist, but we just have to treat them differently because they don't look the same. And the other thing that we have noticed as we look back at everything that we have done in the past 20 years is that no matter how we assess diet, there are certain things that keep coming up. And one is meats in every type of analysis that we do and through all of the dietary scores that we use, and foods consumed away from home or that are not necessarily, or that are more processed, if you will. So now our focus have shifted more into processing of foods as part of the component of an overall dietary pattern and how that might be shaping disease. And positive foods that healthy foods that are coming up related to positive outcomes are fruit, vegetables, fish, legumes, and healthy fats. Something that I always mention is the importance of integrating social and psychosocial factors. I think this has really anchored our research and has given it a little bit more of a practical focus and real life focus in the context of the reality that Puerto Ricans are living through. The other thing is that it's 20 years. We started this 20 years ago, and I appreciate all of the opportunities that my mentors have given me in starting from so early on, because otherwise I don't know where I would be. I would probably just starting emails right now, because it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of patience to get at this point and answer these questions. But it also gives me hope that we can answer these questions and we can get there. And lastly, foster collaborations. It's beautiful to go back to your collaborators and continue these lines of work. So keep fostering your collaborations. So with that, these were just extras for questions. I want to thank all of my partners who, as you can see, are a lot, but I thank them all. This is a huge endeavor from multiple partners, especially our funders from the NHLBI, Robert Wood Johnson, Danon, Tupoles. We have so many funders and so many partners. Thank all of them, and especially to my amazing team of students, postdoc, and down here is the team at FDI Clinical Research, who is doing all the work every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mattei. Very interesting. I'm going to take the prerogative as the moderator to ask the first question. I'm just curious, in the new prospect study, is it large enough to actually examine reverse migration back, the effects of migration back to Puerto Rico from the US on diet and health?
I think with sufficient time we could, and we do ask about that. So we have questions because circular migration is a big issue. Even in the Boston, Puerto Rican, we had about 30% of the population doing what we call circular migration. And they go back and forth, spend a few years in the island, go back. And now what we're seeing more is people who actually live in both places at the same time. They might live part of the year in one place and part of the year in another, or they might even get health accesses, health services in one place and go back. So we do have a very detailed questionnaire about those migration patterns. And I think that within 2 cycles, we could definitely get that data and assess that.
Thank you. The first question from the audience comes from Larissa Constantinou, and she asks, which results of your research can be generalized to other populations, and how can your results be useful for designing new studies?
Excellent question. So it's very interesting because I always say that my research is very specific and very generalizable at the same time. What we end up doing is that all of our processes and all of our questionnaires, we try to develop in a general way so that other groups can use them and can adapt them in their settings. So for example, the questions on behavioral, on eating behaviors, for that's right now is a gap. We don't study that as much. We study diet quality, diet intake very, very well. We have metrics for that, but not on behaviors. And we have created questionnaires on dietary behaviors that are general enough that can be used across populations and can be used for other studies. The results, actually, we have been seeing very similar results in other island settings. And I have collaborations with investigators who focus on island setting because we have similar food systems, similar dietary colonization processes, similar health disparities. And this has been very, very common. In terms of the Latino community, there are things that are similar, there are things that are not. But having said that, because we have sort of standardized the process of research, that has been very useful for us to look at those comparisons. But we have seen very, very similar results in Guam, for example, in American Samoa, for example, and with food insecurity, with food access, and those results tend to be a little bit more generalizable to those populations. Remind me the second part of the question.
The second part was how would your results be useful in designing new studies? How would your findings be useful for designing new studies?
Oh my goodness, I'm gonna, please email me, and I'm going to refer you to 2 papers that we wrote precisely to share all the lessons that we have learned from setting up these studies. Because to me, that has been the biggest lessons, is how do you even get your partners aligned? How do you design this? All of these questions and lessons learned on the road. Because one thing is designing it and planning it, and the other thing is actually conducting it. That's an excellent question, and I think that we should be more open in research about the actual conduct of these large observational studies, because they are not easy to run. And I have to appreciate the mentoring that I've had in nutritional epidemiology, that my mentors run large studies, and they have told me about all the pitfalls that can happen and how to solve them. Although nobody tells you that a hurricane is gonna come and completely destroy all of your freezers, but you kind of figure that out. And yes, we have many lessons, and we have published several papers on that.
The next question is from Thomas Chin, who asks, is sodium from I think it's probably in reference to the work you were doing in Puerto Rico, but it says, is this sodium from food only, not including water sources?
Yes, correct. That's only from food.
Okay. The next question is from someone who you know well, Jose Orivas, and he says, this is not a question, but a deserved comment. 20 years ago, I had the privilege of working with you on the grant that started this story. Today, you have made us all so proud. As we collaborate on another grant, I am excited for what lies ahead.
Ah, I'm in camera. Don't make me blush and don't make me cry. That's awesome. Thank you. I am super excited. By the way, I'm here, so we're about to ship all of the samples this week to you, just so you know.
Okay, the next question is from Alice Lichtenstein, and she says, Josie, really interesting to hear about the progression of your work. With regard to your current study, after Maria, was there a change in the relative cost of different foods and beverages? And the same question in terms of changes in the availability of foods and beverages.
Yes, to both. The prices did increase, and that is something that we are right now in the middle of renewal for our grant, continued renewal. And for next cycle, we're going to be focusing more on the food access part. And we included questions on food expenses and food cost. And that's a partnership that we have with an USDA investigator. So yes, they did increase, and food prices in Puerto Rico are massively high. We are prone to additional taxes, again, being an island, and going back to the question about how our research applies to others. Being an island, we have extra taxes because everything needs to be imported and needs to be paid. And 85% of our food is imported. So food is really expensive. And for the distribution system kind of also change, we are right now, which I didn't show, but I would love to talk about the other part of our work, which is the practical part. And one of our projects is precisely trying to revert that and trying to shift that 80% and bring back more of the local produce and local products in general, which we can be more self-sustainable in terms of our food. But yes, it definitely affected, and that's something that we are going to be tracking in our next cycle.
The next question is from, excuse me, from Shandong Wong. And he says, nice work. In addition to the psychosocial, environmental, and behavioral and dietary patterns you presented, could you comment on the potential role of the remaining factors, such as genetic predisposition, maternal environment, a factor for type 2 diabetes, obesity, and chronic disease in Puerto Rico?
Thank you. Yes, and part of the reason why I always come here is to show all the work that we're doing is because I really welcome collaborations, including studies on this, because we have the data, but we don't have the capacity to do those right now. We have talked, and Jose and I have talked about expanding into a more genomics and genome-wide analysis, and that's within our radar. I don't know how much that's going to be playing a role. I think that overall the research keeps pointing at that having a less of a percent in chronic disease as the social determinants, and this is why we have also focused on the social determinants. And even our grant on social epigenetics is taking both things into account, and we really are taking consideration of how the social aspect are affecting the genetics part, the epigenetics. So I think that we are interested, but right now we're really focusing on the social priorities, especially given the context in the island. Maternal health is really important here. It's something that is in our radar. I haven't found the right group to work for that, but it's in our radar because the maternal disparities are quite wide. Puerto Rico has a really high prevalence of maternal death and low services for maternal, for child and maternal services. So I think that that's something that we can get into a little bit more.
Okay, and the final question is from Thomas Chen, and he asks about multi-generational factors, living together or not, cooking together or not, influence or not influence behaviors, etc. So
love it, because we have a clinical trial. This is why I'm here, launching the clinical trial and sending Jose his samples. But we have a clinical trial right now, and we are recruiting the participants for the trial. But as a secondary aim for that, we are also recruiting a household member. for the participant and asking all of the same questions without intervening on that person. And we want to see if there are any effects, but we're also having all of the baseline data of these two people in the same household. And we're going to be able to correlate their dietary habits, intake and behaviors, as well as all of their health outcomes, because we're going to be measuring everything in the participant as well as in the household member. We are very aware that these things happen together, and again, the social component being very, very forefront in our work is something that we incorporate into our work as well. So thank you for bringing it up, and we are working on it.
Well, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation and for addressing all those questions. It was nice to see.
Love it. Thank you so much for receiving me. Always happy to be here.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.